Hello again. Welcome and thank you for joining us today. My name is Demetria Caston, and I'm the Executive Director for Impact Austin. We're honored that you're spending your lunch with us for our second session of our Discovery Days 2023, focus on data equity and impact. These sessions would not be possible without our wonderful sponsors. Thank you to our title sponsor, FVF Law Injury Attorneys, and to our premium sponsor, C2C Media. Now, let me share a little bit about who we are for those of you who may not know. Founded 20 years ago this year, Impact Austin is a collective giving women's philanthropy group or giving circle open to any individual who identifies as a woman who desires to pool their resources with other community-minded women to make a difference in the lives of others in our community. Our mission is to cultivate and expand the knowledge, passion, and generosity of our members to make a positive impact by developing strong relationships and leveraging the power of collective giving. Our vision is to unlock the potential in our community by uniting to fulfill our philanthropic purposes. Since 2003, Impact Austin has donated over $8.2 million, awarding 112 grants serving 91 local nonprofit organizations. As women with a passion for giving back, we are truly stronger and more impactful when we collectively give back to our community. Our current grant cycle for community and education just closed yesterday. Every grant cycle, Impact Austin members work together in grant review committees to narrow the applicants to 2 finalists in each focus area. The top vote getter will receive the primary grant of 80% of the total dollars collected for that focus area. The other finalists will receive the secondary grant, 20% of the total dollars collected. The grant amounts are now announced at the start of each grant cycle. We're excited to join with these future community partners to champion their causes together. Of course, all of this would not be possible without the generosity, commitment, and hearts of our members. All of you are simply amazing. Thank you for all you do for our community partners. As those needs in our communities continue to grow, we invite everyone to join us by visiting our website, impactaustin.org, to find out how to be a part of our collective giving movement. As you can see, our annual fund, you can go to the next one, Nicole, thank you. Our annual fund, as we're celebrating 20 years with fun giveaways at this year's signature events, the fabulous prize package for Discovery Days offers gift certificates for wine tasting at Messina Hoff Winery, Tiff's Treats, Hey Bueno Bakery, Moonshine Patio Bar and Grill, and Chewy's. To be entered in our winter annual fund drive raffle, you can make a gift of $20 or more to our annual fund as tribute to help us celebrate 20 years of impactful grant making here in Central Texas. Donations can be received by February 23rd, 2023 at 11 p.m. Central Time to be considered for the drawing. The winner will be announced at the Discovery Days session on February 24th in just 2 weeks. So make sure you visit our website and be entered for these fabulous drawings. Now, as to why we're here today. Today's session pertains to data equity, using an equity lens to consider how data is collected, analyzed, and interpreted. Our presenter, Dr. Ashley Hickson, will cover the challenges that exist when equity is not centered on data and consider best practices for developing a data collection and analysis framework for driving meaningful impact. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Ashley Hickson. We are honored to hear your presentation, and we look forward to our Q&A session right after.
Good afternoon, everybody. Oh, it's so different seeing myself all on the screen. I'm very happy to be here. I am going to share my slides. Demetria, would you mind just hitting like having a reaction if you could see the slides once they're on the screen. Okay. And actually, I can no longer see you, Demetria. Do you mind coming off mute to confirm?
We can just see you now, Dr.
Oh, you can only see me?
Your slides are coming up shortly.
Oh, okay. I could just sit tight.
You're welcome to share your screen as well if that's easier for you.
Okay. I thought it was being shared.
There we go.
You can
We
see it now.
see your
Oh my
slides
goodness.
and we
Oh my
see you
goodness.
as well. Thank you.
My sincere apologies, y'all. Okay. So now let me come over here. I am so sorry. This worked just fine in our practice run. Let me.
If you want to start your presentation, we can get your slides up for you in about 30 seconds. Got it?
Okay. Oh, okay. So I'm not controlling it. Is that what you're telling me?
No, you are.
You are now.
Okay. Okay. So I apologize, y'all. For some reason, it's not showing up in presenter mode. It was showing that earlier, but it's okay. I know my slides, so I'll work with it as best as I can. So again, my name is Dr. Ashley Hickson, and the title of the presentation is Data Equity and Impact. And this is about using information to advance racial justice and social change. And so I want to give a quick high-level background. I have a DrPH in Health Equity and Social Justice from Johns Hopkins, and I completed a 3-part mixed methods dissertation project. And what that means is that I utilize multiple different data analysis techniques, including qualitative and quantitative analysis in my work. And I also completed an MPH at UT Health Science Center many moons ago. And even further back, I completed a BBA BS at the University of Texas at Austin. Professionally, I have 8 years of full-time work experience, both community and leadership in the nonprofit sector. And I'm a former epidemiologist in the area of health informatics. And I have 12 years of full-time praxis in health equity and racial justice. Too long, don't read, as they say on social media. I'm an intersectional womanist and social epidemiologist, and I'm very happy to be here with y'all today. I apologize. I'm realizing that y'all aren't seeing me change the slides. I'm not sure what's happening. Could we maybe load on y'all's end?
Yep, I'm going to pull that up.
Yes, I don't know what's happening, y'all. My sincerest apologies. It worked just fine a few minutes ago. But if we could pick up at slide 3, that would be perfect. Let me stop sharing. Okay.
Okay, Dr. Hickson, I think we have it up.
Okay, thank y'all so much. And just one more second, I'm gonna move my deck over here so I can see my notes, and then we're perfect. I apologize. This has never happened during a presentation, but the key learning points for today include what is data equity, frameworks to operationalize data equity, biases to consider when comparing impact data of one organization to another, who gets to define how impact is measured, and how we could use data to better inform our investments in social change work. It's okay to go to the next slide. Thank you so much. And so now I'm just going to give a little bit of an introduction and background. Next slide, please. And so as with anything, it's important to understand what exactly we're talking about today. And so what is data equity? And data equity refers to the consideration through an equity lens of the ways in which data is collected, analyzed, interpreted, and distributed. Next slide, please. And so why does data equity matter? It matters for several reasons, but I'm going to highlight just a few right here. Failing to deploy a data equity framework in your data collection and analysis and interpretation practice is extremely harmful and counterproductive to meaningfully advancing social change. This shows up in several ways. It can either mask existing inequities or emerging inequities. And so an example of that is mass incarceration and ethnicity data collection. So when it comes to collecting data on mass incarceration, there isn't really a standardized process that law enforcement officers have to carry out. And as a result, everyone doesn't collect data on race and ethnicity the same way. And so when we look at mass incarceration, what we're seeing is an increase in the white population of people who are incarcerated, but we don't know if that's truly white American people who are being arrested at a higher rate or white Latinx people who are being arrested. And so that's one of the challenge with not thinking through data equity. Another one is that it reduces the agency of the people who are receiving the intervention or being studied. And so an example of this is here in Texas specifically, there's been analyses on exclusionary discipline practices in Texas K through 12 schools. And so if you look at that, you will see that nearly 50% of the people that are suspended are African-American students, despite representing about 13% of the population. And so if you're looking at that analysis, it may lead you to believe that there may be more behavioral issues or things of that nature going on, as opposed to thinking more systemically about why are these Black children being suspended at higher rates disproportionate to their student population. Additionally, it could perpetuate biases. A classic example of that is I work in the food and nutrition space, even though I identify as a health equity professional, and that's been my practice for the past 12 years, I've worked in food and nutrition for going on 8 years. And so I'm somewhat tethered to food and nutrition as well. And so NHANES is a large nationally representative data set that looks at sugary drink consumption by race and ethnicity, as well as different age categories and different types of SSBs. One thing that is commonly stated in the food and nutrition space is that there are higher rates of consumption among Black and Latinx children and Black and Latinx adults of SSBs. And this has led to many people deploying SSB taxes as strategies that would actually advance health equity. However, when you look at the most recently available data, there aren't consistent differences in consumption between Black and Latinx people at every age when compared to white people. In fact, there are some age categories where white people consume more sugary drinks. And so again, when you don't think through data equity on the front end, it can perpetuate biases and actually do more harm, even when you're designing an intervention. Next slide, please. And so hence, across the data life cycle, you want to think about data equity, and it should inform every stage. And that includes collection, analysis, and interpretation. And these are just a few of the questions you should think through. So when it comes to collection, it's important to think through, are my instruments designed to gather the information I need? So for example, if I am seeking to look at a very specific population, that data may not be available in publicly available data sets. I may need to consider if a qualitative analysis would be best. Who has identified this information as being important? Did this come from the community? Did it come from stakeholders? What's guiding your collection practice? Am I missing an opportunity for more granularity? A classic example of this is when you think about if I was going to do a study on, let's keep it with mass incarceration because that's kind of easy to think through. If I'm doing a study on mass incarceration, I want to see how it impacts Black people, I may want to decide what type of Black people are most likely to be impacted by mass incarceration. Because if I'm living in an area where there's a high Caribbean population, or I'm living in an area where there's a high Nigerian population that is also being counted as Black, that may not be the target demographic that's best to examine that in. Another one is analysis. How does the population receiving the intervention or being studied view the data? What factors may be missing? And by factors, I mean confounders. And so confounders are variables that are associated with the exposure as well as the outcome. And so when you think about complex social problems, a lot of times there are multiple things that are affecting the outcomes, and it's not just one thing. And you want to make sure that you're thinking through how those factors that also affect the exposure and the outcome may influence your data. And lastly, under analysis, is my analysis plan the best approach for what I'm seeking to understand? When it comes to interpretation, how have these biases been considered? As I mentioned on the previous slide, not thinking through the ways in which your bias may show up can actually harm, it could do more harm than good. And does my interpretation have the potential to cause more harm? And what do participants gain from the results? If our research, if our intervention, if our program isn't actually going to yield something that's going to benefit the participants, then it's something that we need to reevaluate as being equitable at all. Next slide, please. And so now I'm going to give a high-level overview of frameworks. Next slide. And so on the front end, there are several frameworks that you can consider. In the essence of time today, I'm going to give you two of my favorite frameworks that you can apply and think about your data through an equitable lens. I apply an intersectional and racial framework to everything I can. So intersectionality is the theoretical framework for understanding how multiple social identities, such as race, gender, sexual orientation, SES, which is socioeconomic status, and disability intersect at the micro level of individual experience to reflect interlocking systems of privilege and oppression. And so these interlocking systems can be things like racism, sexism, heterosexism, and classism, and that occurs at the macro socio-structural level. And so that's a bit of a mouthful. The best way to kind of contextualize this is imagine if you're thinking about someone who's experiencing poverty, but then that person is also Black. And then that person may also have a queer identity. And that person is also living with a disability. That person is going to have a unique set of complex challenges compared to someone who may just be experiencing poverty, and they may be a cisgender heterosexual white person. And so thinking through intersectionality will ensure that your data does not miss the opportunity to capture those subpopulations that may be more vulnerable. And this was developed by American civil rights advocate and leading scholar of critical race theory, Kimberly Crenshaw. Next slide, please. Okay, so sticking with mass incarceration again, although jail populations for men have decreased and this is an example of intersectionality in praxis. And so I just want to kind of elucidate why it's important. And so if you're only thinking about mass incarceration through the lens of men, which a lot of people tend to think about because men do have a higher risk of being incarcerated relative to their percentage in the population. But although jail populations for men have decreased 9% between 2008 and 2018, the population of women who've been incarcerated has increased 15%. And for LGBTQIA women specifically, they are overrepresented at every stage of the criminal legal system. So much so that 21% of transgender women have been incarcerated during their lifetime. And as I said, as you continue to go down and get more granular, as you think through intersectionality, this chart here shows racial and ethnic disparities in having been in jail prison among transgender women. And so as you can see, even when you go from looking at mass incarceration collectively to narrowing it down to women, to then looking at LGBTQIA women, to then looking at transgender women, to then looking at Black transgender women, you can see that the risk is substantial. It's double the risk of other women that are in their same category. So this is why mass incarceration is important. And I just want to give you one more statistic on it. The number of women incarcerated has actually increased 700% in the past 40 years. And when you look at Texas specifically, rates have increased 986% since 1980. So, and in prisons, it's increased 951%. So again, that's why it's important to think through what data am I looking at, what population am I looking at, what's the problem, and how can I get more granular? Next slide, please. Thank you. And so racial justice is very important to collecting, analyzing, and interpreting data through an equity lens as well. According to Race Forward, racial justice is a vision and transformation of society to eliminate racial hierarchies and advance collective liberation, where Black, Indigenous, Latinx, Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders in particular have the dignity, resources, power, and self-determination to fully thrive, which is a beautiful way of saying that we cannot advance health equity. We cannot advance social equity. We cannot advance social change, social impact, any of those indicators of a healthy country and a thriving nation without actually centering racial justice. Next slide, please. So now, as someone who is trained both in health equity and epidemiology, let me lead with the fact that these next few slides talk about obesity, but that's not to perpetuate weight stigma. So I apologize in advance for anybody who sees these slides. I'm not trying to activate anything. I promise it's going to be a meaningful example here. And so I'm going to walk you through how failing to take a racial justice framework can create misleading narratives and perpetuate biases in your data interpretation. Additionally, I want to pause and recommend the book, Fearing the Black Body by Dr. Sabrina Strings. It goes into the racist history of fat phobia in general and how harmful it is to your public health practice. So, according to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, non-Hispanic Black adults have the highest age-adjusted prevalence of obesity at 49.9%. So this is roughly a 8.5% difference between the overall rates for non-Hispanic white people aged 18 plus. I want to pause for a second so that you can look at the chart on the screen. And if you look at it, you'll see that non-Hispanic Black men actually have lower rates of obesity than non-Hispanic white men. And you'll also see that non-Hispanic Black men have a similar incidence as non-Hispanic white women. Now, when you look at Black women, there is a higher rate, but overall, once you factor that in, it's a roughly 8.5% difference between the overall rates for non-Hispanic white people aged 18 plus. Next slide, please. So COVID-19, and again, activation warning, I'm not using this to perpetuate any weight stigma, but I did want to pull some of these images because during the peak of the COVID-19 pandemic, obesity was talked about often. People's body size were often pathologized as being the reason why their risk factors were higher for COVID-19 disparities. And so let's go to the next slide, if you do not mind, because I want you to see these mortality rates. So when you look at overall non-Hispanic Black and non-Hispanic white men versus women, remember that the Black-white ratio for obesity was actually not, it was actually smaller for Black men versus white men. But when you look at COVID-19 mortality rates by race and gender, you can see that for Black men, and these are, just to explain these charts, these were done in Michigan and Georgia. So the one on the left is in Michigan, the one on the right is in Georgia. So when you look at the actual mortality rates, you see that Black men died at 6.5 times the rate of white men, despite actually having a lower incidence of obesity. And then when it came to Black women versus white women, that was a 5.9 rate, so 6 times the rate of white women as well. And then when you look in Georgia, it's not as pronounced as it was in Michigan, but it's still more than double the rate in both cases, where there's only an 8.5% difference in obesity rates. And so these numbers show that, like, while, and I'm not saying that obesity is not a potential risk factor, but what I'm saying is obesity does not solely account for the differences in COVID-19 mortality rates by race and gender, as it was originally stated at the beginning of the pandemic. And so this is why taking an equity lens is important, because a 9% difference in obesity prevalence between the groups should not yield something that's nearly 7 times the rate. Next slide, please. Now we're going to talk about checking for bias. And so philanthropies, donors, and grant awarding institutions all contribute to many of the challenges in data equity by perpetuating the nonprofit industrial complex. The NPI refers to a system of relationships between foundations and donors and private nonprofits. And these nonprofits are typically the large national nonprofits. And with the nonprofit industrial complex, a top-down approach is typically deployed where what is funded is driven by the interest of the donor. Next slide, please. Thank you. As such, this can make it challenging to compare impact depending on the issue or population that's being served. So remember, there are data gaps on certain populations. For example, when we think about the way race and ethnicity data is poorly collected by law enforcement, it's easy to understand why increases in the white incarcerated population may not be an accurate reflection of actual increases, as opposed to a lack of ethnicity data for people with Latin identities. Similarly, the indigenous population is significantly underserved by current data collection and analysis practices at every level. And so that includes locally, state, and federal. And so this contributes to indigenous erasure and makes their barriers to well-being difficult to elucidate. Additionally, it can be difficult to compare impact if the organization that is being invested in is smaller. So organizations that are led by Black or Indigenous people experience significant fundraising challenges and capacity issues that I'll expand upon in the next slide. So requiring these large, statistically significant data sets, extensive data on previous years of success in issue areas or results can be challenging for these smaller community-led organizations. So as such, the nonprofit industrial complex reduces the opportunity for these organizations to receive grants and funding because their work and data may not be as meaningful to donors. Next slide, please. So continuing the conversation, comparing impact and equitably leads to fundraising inequities. And these have long-term consequences by underinvesting in the populations that actually need the most support. And so, for example, only 20% of large foundations give to Indigenous communities, and Indigenous people only represent 0.4% of the annual grant dollars that are specifically earmarked to benefit them, despite representing 2% of the population. And so that means that most of the funds that are being invested to serve the Indigenous population are not actually being given to Indigenous people or Indigenous-led organizations. Which is absolutely horrific. And so that's wild to me. When it comes to Black-led organizations, unrestricted net assets are 76% smaller compared to white-led organizations. This is particularly challenging, given there's a large call for these types of funds to advance equity and build internal capacity. I currently serve on a global equity rethink group, and this is something that is being called for even outside of the United States. It's a global call for more unrestricted funds because that helps actually build the internal capacity for these orgs. And this is also after controlling for the educational level of the leaders. And Black women leaders specifically consistently receive less financial support. And this is why social change has not really come to fruition. And this is just a little chart here by the Bridgespan Group, which I'm sure y'all are all familiar with, but it talks about the 4 key barriers to capital for leaders of color. And it includes getting connected, building rapport, securing support, and then sustaining those relationships. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to go over the considerations for measuring impact. Thank you so much. And so I have it broken into 2 big buckets. What is the problem and who is the priority population? And so when it comes to what is the problem, you have to understand who has defined the problem. What are you actually seeking to measure? If you're looking to reduce health disparities, what does that mean? Is there a specific morbidity, a type of mortality? What are you looking to do? And is there an existing publicly available data set? Because if the data already exists, it makes for an easier analysis, and there's opportunities where you can expand on existing data sets. And so the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation collects a lot of data on mortality, morbidity rates, the CDC. There's a lot of existing data sets that can be utilized. And then how does the priority population view the problem? If you were to look at the issue of police brutality, what does that actually mean to the people who are experiencing it? Is it the number of stops? Is it the hostile interactions? Is it actually being confined when you have a nonviolent citation, you have a citation eligible offense? What does it mean to them? And then lastly, is it something that is even measurable during the grant cycle? If you're issuing a 1 to 3 year grant and expecting somebody to reduce COVID-19 mortality rates or CVD mortality rates, that's not really realistic. And so that's why the problem is a very key consideration. Next, who is the priority population? What inclusion and exclusion criteria define this population? As I mentioned earlier, being more granular in how you define a population will allow for a more equitable analysis and will assure that the population that you're actually looking at is relatively more homogeneous and that it makes for a clearer analysis. Are there identities within this population that may increase their risk? Again, thinking through intersectionality, am I looking at this population with gender in mind? And am I thinking through how living with a disability may impact them? Am I thinking through the socioeconomic implications? How can I get more granular? And then lastly, how does this population define themselves? That is very key when it comes to data collection, because you can cause more harm collecting data on the front end by making assumptions about the way they may identify themselves. Next slide, please. So measuring impact also calls for considering the ways in which power dynamics between funders and organizations show up. This is because funders are often disconnected from culturally relevant approaches. Keeping with my food and nutrition background, for example, food is medicine as opposed to strategies that indigenize food systems or advance food justice. There's also an over-reliance on certain types of data, evaluation metrics, and approaches. And so, for example, social justice approaches to people that are experiencing homelessness are discounted as lacking an evidence base, largely because there's been a lot of pilots done. And so some people feel like that's not sufficient evidence of the work being done. But pilots actually give good credence to the efficacy of these programs. For example, the Housing First approach. Lastly, a white-centric view of priorities influence retention rates and sustain relationships with organizations that are led by racially and or ethnically minoritized populations. As I mentioned a few slides back, that sustainability and ability to retain relationships are barriers for leaders of diverse backgrounds. And so, for example, paternalism and how to measure success and not treating diverse leaders like authentic partners and the subject matter experts on the things that their communities experience like they actually are. Next slide, please. So I'm going to wrap up with using data for social change. Next slide. Thank you. And so to properly use data for social change, we have to be mindful and honest about the limitations and opportunities. This means being transparent about the implications of the data. We don't want to overstate in our interpretation the power, the magnitude of our data, or indicate that it has more substantiation than it actually does. While when you're publishing for research, you definitely don't want to underplay its significance. You also don't want to overstate its significance, which is the next one. Do not overstate the data's significance for complex social challenges. For example, if we think through health disparities are not going to be solved solely by a behavioral intervention. We can't solve health disparities through cooking classes. We can't solve them through a food is medicine approach. Those are not going to lead to a meaningful decrease in health disparities. We're not going to solve poverty by financial literacy. And so we want to make sure that when we're thinking through these complex social challenges, that we're also thinking through these complex social interventions that are needed, and we're not overstating what we can actually achieve. Lastly, identify opportunities for more equitable data collection and analyses. That is so important. Even when you've completed your analysis or you've completed your program or your intervention and you're looking at it, always think through how it could have been done with an even more granular lens and how it may have missed the opportunity to understand the challenges from somebody else's perspective, another subpopulation. And that's very key. Next slide. Okay, so I apologize for the tech issues in the beginning. I have no idea what happened, y'all. I'm so frustrated that happened. But I will take questions now. And I sincerely apologize. I don't know what happened with that.
That is quite all right. It has definitely been a Friday for me, as I shared before we jumped into the call. So I think we're just going to say we're going to blame it on the day of the week. It's Friday and look forward to the rest of our day and our weekend. Thank you so much for sharing those frameworks, the nonprofit, industrial complex, measuring impact, fundraising inequities. All of those topics are truly enlightening, and I look forward to us embracing as we move forward as a major funder here in Central Texas. So right now we are going to open it up to a Q&A session. So if you have any questions for Dr. Hickson, please add them in the chat, and I will read them for her to answer, and we will move forward. I see a comment that says, such rich content. Thank you, Dr. Hickson. We will make sure to share a recording of this session as well as a recap next week. For those who did not have an opportunity to jump on, this was very informative presentation. So we will make sure to share it on our social media as well on our website as well. As funders, how could we invest in reducing our biases?
Oh, absolutely. So I have read that only 25% of funders actually have goals around DEI in terms of how they fund, which I found fascinating. So for one, I think it's important to include it in your strategic planning for your organization. Like, how are you going to invest in the community? How many dollars are going to be earmarked for leaders of organizations that come from diverse backgrounds? On the front end, and that also helps with accountability. Additionally, I think it's very important to have an external consultant help you through the strategy. I don't think that's something that should be designed in-house. Get an external consultant to assess your past giving and give you recommendations. And so those would be the two main things I would recommend is one, having an external consultant, and then two, making sure that you actually have goals around this as part of your strategic vision and strategic goals.
That's very helpful because I think so many of us think that we have to just kind of come up with some of these principles and ourselves when there are subject matter experts out there like yourself who can tap in and really help us to efficiently and strategically move forward. Couple questions. Thank you for naming how the fat phobia biases play out in systemic challenges. Excited to share this recording with others. So that was a kudos to you, Dr. Hickson. Thank you so much for that transparency. Another question for you. Please explain or describe the health equity impact assessment tool.
Oh, yes. Okay.
You're actually that one.
I was not prepared for that question. So I actually developed that for my organization, and it was something that was developed so that we would look at where the applications were coming from and to see where we could have the greatest impact. And so I used publicly available data sets at the county level, state level, and at the city level where applicable in order to come up with a measurement tool that would help us to look at levels of poverty, levels of disease morbidity, the diversity score, all of those things. And so it was just a way to kind of objectively score which applicants were coming from areas that were higher need relative to others. And so it was something to just kind of take the bias out of grant making, if you will, and not make assumptions about what that area's, I hate saying vulnerability, but essentially what that area's vulnerability and risk was.
Thank you for that. A couple other questions, probably a lot of great comments regarding your presentation, Dr. Hickson. Will we be able to get a copy of Dr. Hickson's slides? Yes, they will be shared on our website as well, links on social media. Such great content and thought-provoking. It would be helpful to have the slides for additional thoughts while we look internally, and internally is us, Impact Austin. And I definitely agree about as we look internally at our funding process. So subject matter expert, we will be tapping into your expertise pretty soon. Really great information. As volunteers, how do we change approach? Let's see. Thanks so much for insightful and wide-ranging presentation. Can you think of an example of a funder doing great, smart grant making while using equitable data?
Oh, okay.
I think in the beginning of the presentation, you were talking about more of the larger national
Mhm.
organizations. Is there one that you can particularly point to that has truly embraced this space?
So you know what?
And
I'm a fan of the Bridgespan group. That's the group that represents Mackenzie Scott. And I think they are doing a wonderful job of recognizing their privilege and the power dynamics, and also recognizing the opportunities that exist in this space. And so I think their work, while it's kind of they're collecting data, they're releasing reports, they're doing a lot of studies on it. I think that they are kind of on the front end of where we will need to be in about 5 years. Like they're laying the foundation. So, they have invested in a lot of diverse leaders, organizations. Like that is kind of their priority, actually. So I think the Bridgespan group is a wonderful group to look to.
gotcha. Let's see. One of the questions, and I'm not really sure how, let's see, as volunteers, we are subject to the safety and numbers bias funding well-established nonprofits. How do we change our approach to making collective decisions? Was that an internal? That may have been a more internal question for us to think about as an organization. Let me take a look. Do you have any insight or input on that, Dr. Hickson?
Is safety in numbers referring to like the organizational size? Is that what is meant? Like that's a term I haven't heard before, the safety in numbers bias.
Actually, I'm not really sure where the question is really going to. Maybe I'll ask her. She said yes, size.
Okay. So honestly, it comes down to, and I know that y'all have done some work, if I'm not mistaken, around trust-based philanthropy. But
Working on that now.
Yes, exactly. So it's about trusting the size of the leaders and understanding that if you don't invest in, so this is what I hear a lot, is that a lot of these smaller organizations that are led by diverse leaders, they're told that they're too small and they don't have the capacity to carry out the types of interventions and programs that funders want to see. But if you don't invest in their capacity, then they're never going to be able to grow, to be able to carry out these programs. And you're going to continue to invest in these larger white-led organizations who have large indirect costs, and a lot of the funds go directly to staffing as opposed to into the community. And it just becomes an ongoing cycle. And so one thing that I think that would be great is to actually build trust with these smaller, diverse-led organizations, and to also consider giving smaller, unrestricted funds to them, just as grant dollars. And that is a way to kind of invest in their capacity, build trust with them, so that when there is time for a bigger, larger intervention, you already have that relationship and you've also invested in this organization being able to have the capacity to carry it out. But it really just boils down to trust, because you don't need 100, even in those larger organizations, and I can say this because I did work at the American Heart Association. Everyone at that organization isn't carrying out the intervention. It's likely a team of like 2 or 3 people that's carrying out that intervention. So just that's something also to be mindful of, that size isn't really a reflection of who's actually doing the work. And so if there is a smaller organization, why they're smaller, they probably more than likely have the exact same capacity. So you can either invest in their capacity directly or trust that they have the capacity as is.
Can you hear me, Dr. Hickson?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, everyone can hear me. So it seems like we're talking about it being a Friday. You just sounded completely like a robot for me. So so the end of I'll have to read or listen to the recording to get that last question. So I hope everyone else was able to hear your complete answer. Here's a another question for you. How can we better serve diverse leaders and new approaches?
Same answer. Building trust. You have to trust that their approaches are that they know. I mean, one thing that I saw was that for diverse leaders, they're more likely to have the identities and the experiences of the people in the community when compared to white-led leaders. And so you have to, you should give them the grace and understanding that as someone who's more boots on the ground and closer to that community, they know what their community needs. They're the subject matter experts. They're the ones who know the best. I don't feel like I could go into any community and tell them what they need and I know more than them. I don't care how much research I do, how many assessments I conduct. I can't tell that community about themselves. And I think as funders, you have to have that same type of humility of, I don't have all the answers. So who should I trust that does? The people who are actually in the community. So for me, that's a very kind of straightforward approach.
Thank you for that. And apparently I'm the only one that just had some issues. We don't have any other questions at this time. Dr. Hickson, do you have any last thoughts? Anything else you want to share with us to summarize? This has been a wonderful presentation, very thought-provoking for us as funders. We have a nice mix of people on the call today, so everyone has submitted some really great comments, and I'm looking forward to sharing it with those who may not have had an opportunity to jump on. But if you want to summarize and share anything else before we end our session, we would greatly appreciate it.
Absolutely. I want to thank y'all for the opportunity, and I want to compliment y'all for even thinking about this, because as a funder, it's actually easier to not have to think about these things, because it can be intimidating, it can be exhausting, and it's also very brave to admit that, hey, we are figuring it out, and that's okay. That's totally okay. And so I appreciate the invitation, and I just want to commend y'all for even thinking through this, because thinking through data equity is a big step forward in actually advancing meaningful social change. And again, I apologize for the tech issues on the front end. I can't believe that happened. But if you have any questions in any of the slides afterwards, feel free to reach out.
Okay, we'll make sure to include contact information so that if anyone has any questions, if you have an email address you'll be willing to share, that way people can get their questions answered directly, but we'll funnel them through us as well and place them on our website with a summary and a recording of the webinar. We'll make sure to have the Q&A session posted as well for those who may have missed it. Thank you again for a very insightful, research-based, thought-provoking presentation. We look forward to working with you in the future and utilizing you as a subject matter expert as we continue to learn and grow as a community and seek true partnership with our community partners out there. Thank you so much, Dr. Hickson. You have a wonderful Friday, and that concludes our session today.
Y'all too. Bye.
Bye.